The last time I had been discussing some problems of time and literature and of time, space, or what is called in Bakhtin's works and in some other works of people who are following Bakhtin, chronotopos, that is time space. The term was taken from natural sciences. And so we're interested in time, space, and literature as a form of arranging the material that we take either from life or from mythology or from some other sources, documentary sources about the life, or some other literary sources in cases which are studied by intertextual comparison. And all this material is arranged in some way which is called narration. So we have the difference between the plot, the things about which the author, the writer, wants to speak, and the way this material is organized. So the main idea of the difference between the material and the work and the way it is organized, for instance, from the point of view of time and space, but not only from this point of view. This difference was discovered mainly by Russian formalists. So in Russian, the terms for it are fabula, which means the contents, the whole material that we have before the work is written. And the other term is sujet, which can be rendered in different ways. Sometimes people say plot in this meaning, but this is not so good. So, in general, as it is studied in modern narratology, theory of narration, so maybe the best term might be narration. And I think that this discovery of the difference between the material as it is done, as it is used in literature, and the way the author reorganizes the material, this is among the most interesting ideas of Russian literary scholars of the 20s. There is a very interesting document published by Superfin in Tartu works on science systems, Другие познакомым системам. The title of this short publication is Pasternak, critic формального метода. Pasternak is critic of the formal method. The main substance of this publication is a letter written by Boris Leonidovich Pasternak, the famous poet, to Medvedev, the supposed author of the book about sociological study of literature. As we know now, the main real author was Bakhtin. So the interest of the publication and of the letter is in the fact that Pasternak knew very well Medvedev, who was supposed to be the author of the book. Medvedev was a well-known editor. He edited a journal about theater, by the way, which Bakhtin considered to be a very important publication in connection with theater. The Russian title of it is Записки передвижного театра. I'm very much afraid that's not easy to get it here, but I think that possibly your library may get it from Russia in the form of some microphones. The notes of the moving theater. It was published in the beginning of the 20s by Medvedev. Really by Medvedev himself. And he wrote also some other things. Specialists in Russian literature knew him as editor of some materials from archives of Alexander Blok. Just this is not the most brilliant part of his work, because as editor of texts from archives, Medvedev was no good. So Pasternak knew him as an editor and had with him some business-like correspondence, and then suddenly he received the book about Russian formula. And this is sociological critical and what we call now structural or pre-Semiotic critical study of Russian formula. And Pasternak was surprised to read a book like this. He didn't know about the real author, who was Bakhtin. He met Bakhtin much later, as Bakhtin told me. I discussed the letter with Bakhtin. He didn't know about the letter. Pasternak was very much enthusiastic about the book, but this is all this I tell you because Pasternak in his letter says that in general he approves the point of view of Medvedev, as we now know, Bakhtin, on the formal school, critical approach to the formal school. But he doesn't agree with one point in it. Pasternak did, or maybe with 2 points in it. Pasternak didn't agree with Medvedev, Bakhtin being completely against all formalist attempts to study literature, and Pasternak wrote, well, you of course understand that such discoveries as the difference between fabula and sujet, between the contents and or the pre-literary material and the way to make narration. This is a really very important step forward. And so I would like to discuss it. Why was it interesting to Pasternak, and why in general it is important for literature, this discovery. Of course, people knew before, that was not only the idea of Russian formalists, that we may distinguish between something about which the book is written and the way it is being told in the book. But they gave to it quite concrete and definite definition, and they explain how to approach it. Among works that were written a little bit later than the main bulk of formalist essays, I would like to mention to you the book by Viktor Shklovsky about Война и мир. I think that written at the end of the 20s, I think that this is among the most interesting things to analyze concretely one classical work of Russian literature from this point of view. The approach of Shklovsky in this book is very much close to modern intertextual studies. So Shklovsky analyzes some historical documents that were used by Lev Tolstoy. Again, I'm returning to the point that we discussed several weeks before, when you remember I told you about some literary sources of Bulgakov's novel. I told you that there are some works, particularly a short story by Nabokov, that are very similar to Master and Margaret, and so Bulgakov took much from other authors, as many other writers did in different periods, so this is quite usual. What I'm discussing now, and what Shklovsky discussed, is one concrete and very interesting aspect. Lev Tolstoy took much of what is written about in Война и мир from certain historians, from certain works in history. Shklovsky and some other people, possibly the first man to begin to think about this was the famous Russian author Konstantin Leontiev and his brilliant work on Война и мир, стиль в романе графа Толстого «Война и мир». The work was reprinted abroad. So, Russian edition of complete works of Konstantin Leontiev is very difficult to get. It's a very rare edition, never reprinted in Russia itself. Now we have grown interest in Leontiev as a man of the last generation of Slavophiles, but he was not appreciated for many years. But it exists reprinting in one foreign editorial boards in Russian, so you can read it. I think before Formalist, possibly this is the best work on Война и мир. So Shklovsky, following some previous studies, discovered a lot of historians' works that Tolstoy used in Война и мир. If you read Shklovsky, you'll be amazed. Whole pages were taken from other sources. Lev Tolstoy was not extraordinarily interested in rewriting the sources he used. So many parts of historical description of I have in mind most of all strictly historical parts of the novel. So the description of how Napoleon's army moved different periods, what was the whole political diplomatic situation in Europe. All this was taken from some other sources. We should not be amazed because this is a usual thing, and I will give you some recent example of the same approach. So what is important for the author? Not to invent everything, and now I'm speaking not about literary sources, as in case of Bulgakov, but about the sources that belong to non-fiction. The author uses non-fictional sources, but he incorporates them into his own work. He uses them as parts of his own narration. So to the author, not the whole text belongs, but the way he is narrating the story. This is the general idea. In case of Tolstoy, you remember that the main thing is that his historical parts of Война и мир, of War and Peace, are intermingled, are intercrossed with parts describing personal biographies of heroes, something that happened to concrete people whom Tolstoy invented and described. And that part of the novel is not taken from other sources, mostly. But historical parts are connected with this. There are some works that follow this type of narration from among important present-day modern Russian examples. I will point out two works that are directly continuing this type of historical narration. The one is the novel by Vasily Grossman, «Жизнь и судьба», the fate and the life. I think one of very important novels of modern Russian literature. The first part of it was published much earlier. The last part was published not long ago. There was a complicated history of the whole text. But the first part was written just after the war. And it was published separately. The first journal publication was in 1952 in November, and then there was a separate book. So I may tell you just on the basis of my personal conversations with Grossman at the time when he was working on the novel, on the first part that was published in 1952. So I discussed his way of writing this at the time when he read to some friends the first chapters. That was in 1948. He had a lot of Soviet official and German. He could read German materials on that period of the war. So, and the novel mainly the Stalingrad episode of the Second World War is described. And he used much of these materials, so there are many chapters that give simply description of military history of the period, some preparation of the great battle in Stalingrad, and all this is based on Soviet, German, and some other official publications, which he used just in the way Tolstoy used his materials. Then I will give you another example that possibly is even more interesting. I don't know whether anybody succeeded in writing a formal study. I think that it would be very interesting. I mean the way Solzhenitsyn uses his sources in Krasnaya Kolesa, in the Red Wheel, his long historical epic about First World War and Russian Revolution. I will give you only one example. In the last volumes of this epical novel, among marginal heroes, people who are not really very interesting to Solzhenitsyn, but still are described in a concrete way, so we know when this person went out of his house, when he visited Gorky's house on Kranversky Prospect in St. Petersburg, Petrograd at that time, and so on. Among such marginal heroes that are described quite concretely is Sukhanov, a well-known politician and journalist of that period, who wrote memoirs in many volumes, which were a description of the way he remembers the days of the revolution. It's a very concrete book with many details. In Solzhenitsyn, there are some chapters where he describes how Sukhanov went to Gorky's house and what he heard, and then how he went to Smolny Palace and what he saw there. And you see that there are whole pages taken from Sukhanov's book and incorporated into Solzhenitsyn's novel with some additions, with some shortened omitted passages, and with some things that are incorporated into the text. So I think that it would be quite interesting to, using Shklovsky's approach to Vladimir, for instance, to try to write about the the historical sources used by Solzhenitsyn. I think that possibly Solzhenitsyn was combining his knowledge of very good knowledge of Tolstoy's novel with his own experience in writing Gulag Archipelago. You know that, as he puts it in the foreword to the novel, he used documentary evidence of approximately 300 people, incorporating it into his documentary narration. The narration is the only voice, to use Bakhtin's term, the only voice of the author. But there are many details, many concrete descriptions that are taken from other persons, and you may easily see it if you analyze the style of photographical work. I think that in general this is a very interesting topic, that modern studies of intertextuality usually are based on comparing literary works, and the kind of work done by Shkovsky in connection with Frye still is not quite usual in literary works and literary studies. And we need this type of work. I think that in one of my first lectures I gave you another example, not from modern Russian literature, but from Spanish language literature of Latin America. I spoke to some of the people who are present now, but to others today this will be new, and so I will repeat it very shortly. I spoke about one novel which I find possibly among the best novels of the second half of this century in general in the world literature. The author is Vargas Llosa. He's written with double U at the beginning. Vargas Llosa, a Peruvian writer, who in Northern America, I think, became very widely known, not as an author, but because he was nominated for a possible presidentship of Peru, not long ago. He lost, and the winner was a certain Japanese person from Peru. But at that time, much was written about Vargas Llosa. He's a very interesting author. But I'm speaking now about one concrete novel of his, which I see as extraordinarily interesting in different respects. I published a rather long analysis of it in the Russian journal published in Moscow, Latinska America, Latin America. Now it is reprinted in a collection of articles discussing the book by Llosa. The book has in Spanish the title La Guerra del Fin del Mundo, that is the war of the end of the world. There is a Russian translation, Война конца света. It appeared, I think, 4 years ago, the Russian translation. In general, this is the work by young Vargas Llosa, when politically he was much more to the left than now. Now he became politically moderate. At that time, as many other Latin American authors, he belonged to not extraordinary leftist, but still radical left movement. The novel is historical. It is based on concrete events of the end of the previous century, on the peasants' revolt in a certain part of northern Brazil. The revolt was described by one Brazilian journalist that was present at some period during the war, and the war ended with complete extermination of the whole population of that area by Brazilian army that simply killed everybody there. And all this is described first by this Brazilian journalist in a book that became very popular in Brazil. And then by Vargas Llosa, who used the book and who also made the journalist one of his marginal figures. So in this part, the book is a little bit similar to what I told you about Sukhanov as he is represented in Solzhenitsyn's novel. There is one interesting problem for comparative literature in Vargas Llosa novel. Many interesting points, but one which is interesting also for Russian Latin American studies. Possibly all of you read Canarme by Bud, his collection of short stories. You remember that the author, a journalist, himself is described in short stories. The personal features of Babel, as described in Comparative, are extraordinarily similar to the way Vargas Llosa described his journalist, the author of the future book, in his novel. So, as there are some stories about Vargas Llosa being interested in Russian literature and film of the 20s in his youth, I think that really this might be not a coincidence, but I just mentioned it. I think that possibly it will be an interesting topic for some future investigation. Maybe this is simply typological similarity, but it seems to me that Vargas Llosa was really influenced by Babel, not only in the way he described that person, but in general, in the way he puts this journalist in the middle of all the events. And so we have the possibility to describe one point of view inside the whole story. So I'm using here the complex of notions developed by some Russian semioticians on the base of what was done by the formalist school and later by some other Russian philologists. So the idea of the point of view in the novel is given in a very simple and understandable form on the base of all these studies in the book by one of my colleagues of Moscow Tartu Semitician School, Boris Uspensky. The Russian title of the book is Poetica Compositia. It is translated into English as Poetics of Composition. And you may find there the description of what is the point of view from different aspects: spatial, temporal, linguistical, ideological, and so on. So I think that really what is important is the fact that there might be different points of view of different persons in a novel, not coinciding with that of the author. This is the idea connected with Bakhtin's concept of polyphonic structure, but Bakhtin mainly had in mind the ideological differences between points of view. So polyphonic in Bakhtin's sense, that is dialogical, means that we have, his example was Dostoevsky, so in late works by Dostoevsky we have juxtaposition of different ideological points of view, different philosophies of heroes. I gave you once when we discussed the novel Karamazov and Brothers Karamazov as an example of such a novel with different ideological points of view. Now I'm speaking not only about ideological points of view, but also about differences in the possibilities of one person to see the events. Why a journalist is so interesting, both for Babin in his book of short stories about the Civil War, and for Llosa in his book about the Civil War in northern Brazil, because to one person being engaged in the Civil War, it is possible to see only this house when he is fighting with his enemy, only this street, this part of the street. For a journalist, it is in general possible to see a lot of things, because a journalist is moving throughout the whole city where the war is being waged, as it is in the Llosa case. From that point of view, it is understandable why Tolstoy chose as the hero whose point of view is taken in description of Borodino battle, Pierre Bezukhov. because Bezukhov was not a military man, so he was not obliged to be in one definite point. As being an outsider, he could see different aspects of what was going on. So the difference between military heroes in Tolstoy and people like Bezukhov is, from this technical point of view, consists in the relative freedom of a non-military person when we describe all these ends. From this point of view, by the way, technically it's not quite good to use a politician as an observer to describe some political events. Solzhenitsyn was forced to use Sukhanov simply because he was using concretely his own memoirs, so that was necessary for him due to scarcity of other materials that he had in his hands. But in general, it can be shown that a person like a journalist or an outsider like Pierre Bezukhov can be used by a good craftsman, by a good master, if the aim is to describe very complicated net of events, and then an outsider, or a journalist, a person who is not connected with the events themselves, with an outsider, may be used as an interesting instrument through whom we may understand what is going on. So we are dealing here with the problem of the independence of different points of view. So the author has some material given to him by a certain author. Vargas Llosa was not identical in his political views with the journalist who described that kind of civil war and destruction of the North Brazilian population by the Brazilian army. So he took this journalist not as a person who is giving us the idea of what happened, but he only uses this journalist to give us general view, survey of what was being done. And then the novelist needs another person to try to understand what happened. In Vargas Llosa's case, that was a landowner, a very rich man, whose estate was destroyed by the rebels, by the peasants, although he tried to help them. And after that fire that destroyed his estate, the landowner and his wife went for a very long travel to Europe. And the wife became simply mad after all what had happened. And then the final chapter, the final part of the whole novel is after they returned from this travel to Europe. Vargas Llosa is discussing all the events with the only survivor, who really was a witness whom he could believe. And in these last chapters we have a sort of discussion of different possible points of view, what happened. I would not retell you the whole story. I think that the novel is really marvelous and deserves being read. But it is marvelous just because a very interesting technique of introducing different points of view, juxtaposition of different points of view, is used here. And in this way we may say that polyphonic idea of Bakhtin was only a part of what we now can understand by discussing of different angles of description as we can see it in the novel. My last example will be from Russian poetry of the 20th century. I will discuss with you the same problem of non-fictional sources and the way they are used. I will discuss it on the base of one epic poem of Boris Pasternak. So I mentioned to you in the beginning Pasternak's letter before, because I think that Pasternak was very much interested theoretically in this problem. I will discuss with you Pasternak's epic poem, Lieutenant Schmidt, Lieutenant Schmidt. The person who was Pasternak's hero is very important for the whole history of Pasternak's developing as a religious author. I think that at that time few people really understood what Pasternak wanted to tell the literature. Extraordinarily interesting, for instance, are remarks by Marina Tsvetaeva. You remember that Marina Tsvetaeva, the famous Russian emigre poet, was in close contact with Pasternak. They exchanged many letters. Some of them are preserved and published now in Russian, German, and so on. So we may see that they followed each other's work, and she was not alien to Pasternak. And still, she wrote to him that Lieutenant Schmidt is not his hero. Why did he choose such a hero? If we look at this from the point of view of later Pasternak's development, unknown at that time to Tsvetaeva, we'll see that in Schmidt there are many features that can be compared to some heroes of his later prose works. Schmidt is a religious person, a Christian. He is chosen to be the leader of a mutiny, of a revolutionary revolt of the fleet in the Black Sea. All this happens during the first Russian Revolution, in the beginning of the century. The poem was written 20 years after the events that happened there. Pasternak discussed in some of his published interviews, but also at some of his poetical concerts, evenings when I was present, before the public audience, and in some private conversation, which I listened to. He discussed the way he used materials for his poem. A lot of personal documents by Schmidt himself connected with him, particularly his correspondence, were published at that time, and also the documents of the trial of Schmidt were published. What is really astonishing is the literacy with which Pasternak tried to render the exact words of the documents in his poetical text. I may give you as an example the last speech of Schmidt during the trial. It seems now very strange, because if you read it now, after all that happened to Pasternak himself, it might seem to you that Pasternak is describing his own fate. He was persecuted he was chosen as a victim. But as a Christian person, he understood this as something that was really good in the long run. And all this is described in this last speech, which seems to be quite personal from the point of view of late Pasternak. At that time, it was not at all connected with Pasternak's own biography. But we have some interesting evidence from a person who was at that time close to Pasternak that may throw some light on the origin of the problem. Here I am returning to the problem of Pasternak's religion that we once discussed. I was asked a question about Pasternak's religion after one of my lectures. I think that among really very important statements of a witness that one may find in a recent book by Nikolai Nikolaevich William Wilmot on Pasternak. We can find in the book the following story. William Wilmot is quite a young man, much younger than Pasternak was close to Pasternak, visited him often and told the contents of their discussions. All this was in the 20s, just at the time when two Pasternak's long poems about the First Russian Revolution were written. And Nikolai Nikolaevich William Wilmot gives the following story in his book, which is published now, so you may look at this page. Pasternak is discussing his project to write a cycle of poems about the God, with the addition that will not be the great God, that would be the God as a man, and he gives the title of Rilke's short cycle of poems and prose, Geschichte von Liebenthal. Something like this. And then Pasternak says to Wilmot, according to Wilmot's witness testimony, that I think could not have been invented later, because there is always a problem with a book. I heard the text as it was read by Wilmot to some friends. That was immediately after Pasternak's death, but so the book was written much later. But I don't think that he could have invented it. Pasternak says, well, they will not, that means official person, will not permit me to do it now. So I will not write this cycle of poems just right now. As you understand, this is the first idea of the whole Avenger cycle that we have in Dr. Животов. So this is a precious piece of evidence, because if really it is so, and I believe it, in that case it means that Pasternak's idea to write the whole cycle of poems about Jesus was already in his mind at that early time. I wouldn't write it now. First, I would write a poem about Russian Revolution of 1905. And then it occurs to me that possibly the choice of the Lieutenant Schmidt as the main hero is not accidental, as it appeared to Tsvetaeva, who didn't know about Pasternak's plans, projects at that time. So maybe that was really combination of two different projects. First, he would like to write about a person who was a victim, died being persecuted by the society. And that is, so to say, the first approximation to write a cycle of poems about Jesus. And then he would write about Jesus himself. In that case, Little and Schmidt is simply part of both projects. I will return after our short break to some concrete details about the use of documents and how Pasternak himself described it in his remarks about his poem. I think that it is interesting from this point of view. So let us have a very short break just for you to rest 10 minutes. Then we'll simply translate Russian questions into English. So the last time I had been discussing some problems of time and literature and of time, space, or what is called in Bakhtin's works and in some other works of people who are following Bakhtin, chronotopos, that is time-space. The term was taken from natural sciences. So we're interested in time, space, and literature as a form of arranging the material that we take either from life or from mythology or from some other sources, documentary sources about the life, or some other literary sources in cases which are studied by intertextual comparison. And all this material is arranged in some way which is called narration. So we have the difference between the plot, the things about which the author, the writer, wants to speak, and the way this material is organized. So the main idea of the difference between the material and the work and the way it is organized, for instance, from the point of view of time and space, but not only from this point of view. This difference was discovered mainly by Russian formalists. So in Russian, the terms for it are fabula, which means the contents, the whole material that we have before the work is written. And the other term is sujet, which can be rendered in different ways. Sometimes people say plot in this meaning, but that's not so good. So in general, as it is studied in modern narratology, theory of narration, so maybe the best term would be narration. And I think that this discovery of the difference between the material as it is done, as it is used in literature, and the way the author reorganizes the material. This is among the most interesting ideas of Russian literary scholars of the 20s. There is a very interesting document published by Superfin and Tartu works on science systems, другие познакомые системы. The title of this short publication is Pasternak, critic формального метода. Pasternak is critic of the formal method. The main substance of this publication is a letter written by Boris Leonidovich Pasternak, the famous poet, to Medvedev, the supposed author of the book about sociological study of literature. As we know now, the main real author was Bakhtin. So the interest of the publication and of the letter is in the fact that Pasternak knew very well Medvedev, who was supposed to be the author of the book. Medvedev was a well-known editor. He edited a journal about theater, by the way, which Bakhtin considered to be a very important publication in connection with theater. The Russian title of it is Записки передвижного театра. I'm very much afraid that's not easy to get it here, but I think that possibly your library may get it from Russia in the form of some microphones. The notes of the moving theater. It was published in the beginning of the 20s by Medvedev. Really by Medvedev himself. And he wrote also some other things. Specialists in Russian literature knew him as editor of some materials from archives of Alexander Blok. Just this is not the most brilliant part of his work, because as editor of texts from archives, Medvedev was no good. So Pasternak knew him as an editor and had with him some business-like correspondence, and then suddenly he received the book about Russian formalism. This is sociological critical and what we call now structuralist or pre-semiotic critical study of Russian formalism. And Pasternak was surprised to read the book like this. He didn't know about the real author, who was Bakhtin. He met Bakhtin much later, as Bakhtin told me. I discussed the letter with Bakhtin. He didn't know about the letter. Pasternak was very much enthusiastic about the book, but this is all this I tell you because Pasternak in his letter says that in general he approves the point of view of Medvedev, as we know, Bakhtin, on the formal school, critical approach to the formal school. But he doesn't agree with one point in it. Pasternak did, or maybe with 2 points in it. Pasternak didn't agree with Medvedev, Bakhtin being completely against all formalist attempts to study literature, and Pasternak wrote, well, you of course understand that such discoveries as the difference between fabula and sujet, between the contents and or the free literary material and the way to make narration. This is a really, really important step forward. And so I would like to discuss it. Why was it interesting to Pasternak, and why in general it is important for literature, this discussion. Of course, people knew before, that was not only the idea of Russian formalists, that we may distinguish between something about which the book is written and the way it is being told in the book. But they gave to it quite concrete and definite mm, definition, and they explain how to approach it. Among works that were written a little bit later than the main bulk of formalist essays, I would like to mention to you the book by Viktor Shklovsky about Война и мир. I think that written at the end of the 20s, I think that this is among the most interesting attempts to analyze concretely one classical work of Russian literature from this point of view. The approach of Shklovsky in this book is very much close to modern intertextual studies. So Shklovsky analyzes some historical documents that were used by Lev Tolstoy. Again, I am returning to the point that we discussed several weeks before, when, you remember, I told you about some literary sources of Bulgakov's novel. I told you that there are some works, particularly a short story by Nabokov, that are very similar to Master and Margaret, and so Bulgakov took much from other authors, as many other writers did in different periods, so this is quite usual. What I'm discussing now, and what Shklovsky discussed, is one concrete and very interesting aspect. Lev Tolstoy took much of what is written about in Война и мир from certain historians, from certain works in history. Shklovsky and some other people, possibly the first man to begin to think about this was the famous Russian author Konstantin Leontiev in his brilliant work on Война и мир, Стиль в романе Графа Толстого Война и мир. The work was reprinted abroad. So Russian edition of complete works of Konstantin Leontiev is very difficult to get. It's a very rare edition, never reprinted in Russia itself. Now we have grown interest for Leontiev as a man of the last generation of Slavophiles, but he was not appreciated for many years. But it exists reprinting in one foreign editorial boards in Russian, so you can read it. I think before formalist, possibly this is the best work on Война и мир. So Shklovsky, following some previous studies, discovered a lot of historians' works that Tolstoy used in Война и мир. If you read Shklovsky, you'll be amazed. Whole pages were taken from other sources. Lev Tolstoy was not extraordinarily interested in rewriting the sources he used. So many parts of historical description of I have in mind most of all strictly historical parts of the novel. So the description of how Napoleon's army moved different periods, what was the whole political diplomatic situation in Europe. All this was taken from some other sources. We should not be amazed, because this is a usual thing, and I will give you some recent example of the same approach. So what is important for the author? Not to invent everything, and now I'm speaking not about literary sources, as in case of Bulgakov, but about the sources that belong to non-fiction. The author uses non-fictional sources, but he incorporates them into his own work. He uses them as parts of his own narration. So to the author, not the whole text belongs, but the way he is narrating the story. This is the general idea. In case of Tolstoy, you remember that the main thing is that his historical parts of Vainania, of War and Peace, are intermingled, are intercrossed with parts describing personal biographies of heroes, something that happened to concrete people whom Tolstoy invented and described. And that part of the novel is not taken from other sources, mostly. But historical parts are connected with this. There are some works that follow this type of narration from among important present-day modern Russian examples. I will point out two works that are directly continuing this type of historical narration. The one is the novel by Vasily Grossman, «Жизнь и судьба», the Fate and the Life. I think one of very important novels of modern Russian literature. The first part of it was published much earlier. The last part was published not long ago. You know, there was a complicated history of the whole text. But the first part was written just after the war. And it was published separately. The first journal publication was in 1952 in Novy Mir, and then there was a separate book. I may tell you just on the basis of my personal conversations with Grossman at the time when he was working on the novel, on the first part that was published in 1952, so I discussed his way of writing this at the time when he read to some friends the first chapters. That was in 1948. He had a lot of Soviet official and German. He could read German materials on that period of the war. So, and the novel mainly the Stalingrad episode of the Second World War is described. And he used much of these materials. So there are many chapters that give simply description of military history of the period, some preparation of the great battle in Stalingrad, and all this is based on Soviet, German and some other official publications, which he used just in the way Tolstoy used his materials. Then I will give you another example that possibly is even more interesting. I don't know whether anybody succeeded in writing a formal study. I think that it would be very interesting. I mean the way Solzhenitsyn uses his sources in Krasnaya Kolesa, in the Red Wheel, his long historical epic about First World War and Russian Revolution. I will give you only one example. In the last volumes of this epical novel, among marginal heroes, people who are not really very interesting to Solzhenitsyn, but still are described in a concrete way, so we know when this person went out of his house, when he visited Gorky's house on Kronevsky Prospect in St. Petersburg, Petrograd at that time, and so on. Among such marginal heroes that are described quite completely is Sukhanov, a well-known politician and journalist of that period, who wrote memoirs in many volumes, which were description of the way he remembers the days of the revolution. It's a very concrete book with many details. In Solzhenitsyn there are some chapters where he describes how Sukhanov went to Gorky's house and what he heard, and then how he went to Smolny Palace and what he saw there. And you see that there are whole pages taken from Sukhanov's book and incorporated into Solzhenitsyn's novel with some additions, with some short and omitted passages, and with some things that are incorporated into the text. So I think that it would be quite interesting to, using Shklovsky's approach to Vladimir, for instance, to try to write about the source, the historical sources used by Solzhenitsyn. I think that possibly Solzhenitsyn was combining his knowledge of, very good knowledge of Tolstoy's novel with his own experience in writing Gulag Archipelago. You know that, as he puts it in the foreword to the novel, he used documentary evidence of approximately 300 people, incorporating it into his documentary narration. The narration is the own voice, to use Bakhtin's term, the only voice of the author. But there are many details, many concrete descriptions that are taken from other persons, and you may easily see it if you analyze the style of Archipelago. I think that in general this is a very interesting problem, that modern studies of intertextuality usually are based on comparing literary works, and the kind of work done by Shklovsky in connection with Vladimir still is not quite usual in literary works and literary studies, and we need this type of work. I think that in one of my first lectures I gave you another example, not from modern Russian literature, but from Spanish language literature of Latin America. I spoke to some of people who are present now, but others today this will be new, and so I will repeat it very shortly. I spoke about one novel which I find possibly at the moment the best novels of the second half of this century in general in the world literature. The author is Vargas Llosa. He's written with double U at the beginning. Vargas Llosa, a Peruvian writer, who in Northern America I think became very widely known, not as an author, but because he was nominated for a possible presidentship of Peru not long ago. He lost, and the winner was a certain Japanese person from Peru. But at that time much was written about Vargas Llosa. He's a very interesting author. But I'm speaking now about one concrete novel of his, which I see is extraordinarily interesting in different respects. I published a rather long analysis of it in the Russian journal published in Moscow, Latinska America, Latin America. Now it is reprinted in a collection of articles discussing the book by Diaz. The book has in Spanish the title La Guerra del Fin del Mundo, that is the war of the end of the world. There is a Russian translation, Война конца света. It appeared, I think, 4 years ago, the Russian translation. In general, this is the work by young Vargas Llosa when politically he was much more to the left, and now he became politically moderate. At that time, as many other Latin American authors, he belonged to not extraordinary leftist, but still radical left movement. The novel is historical. It is based on concrete events of the end of the previous century, on the peasants' revolt in a certain part of northern Brazil. The revolt was described by one Brazilian journalist that was present at some period during the war, and the war ended with complete extermination of the whole population of that area by Brazilian army that simply killed everybody there. And all this is described first by this Brazilian journalist in a book that became very popular in Brazil. And then by Vargas Llosa, who used the book and who also made the journalist one of his marginal figures. So in this part, the book is a little bit similar to what I told you about Sukhanov as he is represented in Solzhenitsyn's novel. There is one interesting problem for comparative literature in Vargas Llosa novel. Many interesting points, but one which is interesting also for Russian Latin American studies. Possibly all of you read Kanarme by Babbitt, his collection of short stories. You remember that the author, a journalist, himself is described in short stories. The personal features of Babel, as described in Kanarme, are extraordinarily similar to the way Vargas Llosa described his journalist, the author of the future book, in his novel. So, as there are some stories about Vargas Llosa being interested in Russian literature and film of the 20s in his youth, I think that really this might be not a coincidence, but I just mentioned it. I think that possibly it will be an interesting topic for some future investigation. Maybe this is simply typological similarity, but it seems to me that Vargas Llosa was really influenced by Babel, not only in the way he described that person, but in general, in the way he puts this journalist in the middle of all the events. And so we have the possibility to describe one point of view inside the whole story. So I'm using here the complex of notions developed by some Russian semioticians on the base of what was done by the formalist school and later by some other Russian philologists. So the idea of the point of view in the novel is given in a very simple and understandable form on the base of all these studies in the book by one of my colleagues of Moscow Tartu Semitician School, Boris Uspensky. The Russian title of the book is Poetica Compositia. It is translated into English as Poetics of Composition. And you may find there the description of what is the point of view from different aspects: spatial, temporal, linguistical, ideological, and so on. So I think that really what is important is the fact that there might be different points of view of different persons in the novel, not coinciding with that of the author. This is the idea connected with Bakhtin's concept of polyphonic structure, but Bakhtin mainly had in mind the ideological differences between points of view. So polyphonic in Bakhtin's sense, that is dialogical, means that we have, his example was Dostoevsky, so in late works by Dostoevsky we have juxtaposition of different ideological points of view, different philosophies of heroes. I gave you once, when we discussed the novel Karamazov and Brothers Karamazovs as an example of such a novel with different ideological points of view. Now I'm speaking not only about ideological points of view, but also about differences in the possibilities of one person to see the events. Why a journalist is so interesting, both for Babin in his book of short stories about the Civil War, and for Lyosa in his book about the Civil War in northern Brazil, because to one person being engaged in the Civil War, it is possible to see only this house when he is fighting with his enemy, only this street, this part of the street. For a journalist, it is in general possible to see a lot of things, because a journalist is moving throughout the whole city where the war is being waged, as it is in the Lyosa case. From that point of view, it is understandable why Tolstoy chose as the hero whose point of view is taken in description of Borodino battle, Pierre Bezukhov, because Bezukhov was not a military man, so he was not obliged to be in one definite point. As being an outsider, he could see different aspects of what was going on. So the difference between military heroes in Tolstoy and people like Bezukhov is, from this technical point of view, consists in the relative freedom of a non-military person when we describe all these events. From this point of view, by the way, technically it's not quite good to use a politician as an observer to describe some political events. Solzhenitsyn was forced to use Sukhanov simply because he was using concretely his own memoirs, so that was necessary for him due to scarcity of other materials that he had in his hands. But in general it can be shown that a person like a journalist or an outsider like Pierre Bezukhov can be used by a good craftsman, by a good master, if the aim is to describe very complicated net of events, and then an outsider or a journalist, a person who is not connected with the events themselves, with an outsider, may be used as an interesting instrument through whom we may understand what is going on. So we are dealing here with the problem of the independence of different points of view. So the author has some material given to him by a certain author. Vargas Lyosa was not identical in his political views with the journalist who described that kind of civil war and destruction of the North Brazilian population by the Brazilian army. So he took this journalist not as a person who is giving us the idea of what happened, but he only uses this journalist to give us general view, survey of what was being done. And then the novelist needs another person to try to understand what happened. In Vargas Llosa's case, that was a landowner, a very rich man, whose estate was destroyed by the rebels, by the peasants, although he tried to help them. And after that fire that destroyed his estate, the landowner and his wife went for a very long travel to Europe, and the wife became simply mad after all what had happened. And then the final chapter, the final part of the whole novel is after they returned from this travel to Europe. Vargas Llosa is discussing all the events with the only survivor, who really was a witness whom he could believe. And in these last chapters we have a sort of discussion of different possible points of view what happened. I would not retell you the whole story. I think that the novel is really marvelous and it deserves being read. But it is marvelous just because a very interesting technique of introducing different points of view, juxtaposition of different points of view is used here. And in this way we may say that polyphonic idea of Bakhtin was only a part of what we now can understand by discussing different angles of description as we can see it in the novel. My last example will be from Russian poetry of the 20th century. I will discuss with you the same problem of non-fictional sources and the way they are used. I will discuss it on the base of one epic poem of Boris Pasternak. So I mentioned to you in the beginning Pasternak's letter before, because I think that Pasternak was very much interested theoretically in this problem. I will discuss with you Pasternak's epic poem, Lieutenant Schmidt, Lieutenant Schmidt. The person who was Pasternak's hero is very important for the whole history of Pasternak's developing as a religious author. I think that at that time few people really understood what Pasternak wanted to tell Lieutenant Schmidt. Extraordinarily interesting, for instance, are remarks by Marina Tsvetaeva. You remember that Marina Tsvetaeva, the famous Russian emigre poet, was in close contact with Pasternak. They exchanged many letters. Some of them are preserved and published now in Russian, German, and so on. So we may see that they followed each other's work, and she was not alien to Pasternak. And still, she wrote to him that Lieutenant Schmidt is not his hero. Why did he choose such a hero? If we look at this from the point of view of later Pasternak's development, unknown at that time to Tsvetaeva, we'll see that in Schmidt there are many features that can be compared to some heroes of his later prose works. Schmidt is a religious person, a Christian. He is chosen to be the leader of a mutiny, of a revolutionary revolt of the fleet in the Black Sea. All this happens during the first Russian Revolution, in the beginning of the century. The poem was written 20 years after the events that happened there. Pasternak discussed in some of his published interviews, but also at some of his poetical concerts, evenings when I was present, before the public audience, and in some private conversation which I listened to. He discussed the way he used materials for his poem. A lot of personal documents by Schmidt himself connected with him, particularly his correspondence, were published at that time, and also the documents of the trial of Schmidt were published. What is really astonishing is the literacy with which Pasternak tried to render the exact words of the documents in his poetical text. I may give you as an example the last speech of Schmidt during the trial. It seems now very strange, because if you read it now, after all that happened to Pasternak himself, it might seem to you that Pasternak is describing his own fate. He was persecuted. He was chosen as a victim. But as a Christian person, he understood this as something that was really good in the long run. And all this is described in this last speech, which seems to be quite personal from the point of view of late Pasternak. At that time, it was not at all connected with Pasternak's own biography. But we have some interesting evidence from a person who was at that time close to Pasternak that may throw some light on the origin of the problem. Here I am returning to the problem of Pasternak's religion that we once discussed. I was asked a question about Pasternak's religion after one of my lectures. I think that among really very important statements of a witness that one may find in a recent book by Nikolai Nikolaevich William Wilmot on Pasternak, we can find in the book the following story. William Wilmot is quite a young man, much younger than Pasternak was close to Pasternak, visited him often and told the contents of their discussions. All this was in the 20s, just at the time when two Pasternak's long poems about the First Russian Revolution were written. And Nikolai Nikolaevich William Wilmot gives the following story in his book, which is published now, so you may look at this page. Pasternak is discussing his project to write a cycle of poems about the God, with the addition that will not be the great God, that would be the God as a man, and he gives the title of Rilke's short cycle of poems and prose, Geschichte von Liebnico, something like this. And then Pasternak says to Villemont, according to Villemont's witness testimony, that I think could not have been invented later, because there is always a problem with the book. I heard the text as it was read by Villemont to some friends. That was immediately after Pasternak's death, but so the book was written much later. But I don't think that he could have invented it. Pasternak says, well, they will not, that means official person, will not permit me to do it now. So I will not write this cycle of poems just right now. As you understand, this is the first idea of the whole Avenger cycle that we have in Dr. Života. So this is a precious piece of evidence, because if really it is so, and I believe in that case, it means that Pasternak's idea to write the whole cycle of poems about Jesus was already in his mind at that early time. I wouldn't write it now. First, I would write a poem about Russian Revolution of 1905. And then it occurs to me that possibly the choice of Lieutenant Schmidt as the main hero is not accidental, as it appeared to Tsetaeva, who didn't know about Pasternak's plans, projects at that time. So maybe that was really combination of two different projects. First, he would like to write about a person who was a victim, died being persecuted by the society. And that is, so to say, the first approximation to write a cycle of poems about Jesus. And then he would write about Jesus himself. In that case, Lieutenant Schmidt is simply part of both projects. I will return after our short break to some concrete details about the use of documents and how Pasternak himself described it in his remarks about his poem. I think that it is interesting from this point of view. So let us have a very short break just for you to rest 10 minutes. Lieutenant Schmidt, and then of use of Schmidt's correspondence with the woman whom he loved and who is depicted by Pasternak also. Pasternak himself gave his own interpretation of this work based on documents. He himself compared this to the work on poetic translation. The text, I think, you may find in different editions. So there is this publication, I think, is included into his complete works in Russian and published in United States, but also you may find it simply in notes to Lieutenant Schmidt in the edition, for instance, of Bibliotheca Poeta Library of Poets. So Pasternak says that it is the same thing to render, let us say, an English play written in iambic meter, to render it into Russian, or to write a long Russian poem based on documentary materials about the life of a concrete man. So he had considered himself a sort of a translator. He was very much interested in general in translation and in theory of translation and so on, had quite peculiar ideas about this. But what is really interesting is that he considered himself in writing on documentary material, so to say, translator. So he has already something that it is written, and his task is to render it in a poetical form, in Russian poetical form. From this point of view, it is really very interesting to compare the documents and Pasternak's, as I tell you, exact rendering. By the way, in his literary translation, he is not as exact as he is in doing this work, because this work is done as almost a literal translation. And in his poetical translations, in general, from the beginning, from his first attempts to translate from German, he didn't belong to the school of literal poetical translation. So I think that this is a very interesting point, just to understand that to him the problem was not to rewrite, but to render what is important in the document. I think that this problem of poetics, of Russian poetics particularly, may be compared also to another problem studied by many specialists in film and film theory. This is the problem of documentary films being used as parts of artistic films. I don't know whether you are very much interested in Pasolini, the great Italian cinema maker, but there are some films by Pasolini made under the influence of Russian cinema of the 20s, in which usually we have this combination of documentary material and its rearrangement if we have an artistic film. For instance, there is a very important film of Pasolini on Saint Francis. You know that Pasolini was at the same time a Catholic believer and a communist believer. And there are some films in which both things are seen. So in his film about Saint Francis, the small birds and the great birds, uccellini, uccellazzi. There is in the reconstruction of the story of the biography of Saint Francis, he included some modern documents that was part of a documentary film about funerals of the famous Italian communist leader Togliatti, which was made a part of his artistic film. That is, so to say, a quotation from the technique of the Russian films of the 20s. I may give you one example that is interesting, by the way, also because it was discussed in several important theoretical publications of the period. You know that at that time there was a whole trend of a Russian film based on strict non-fiction, on documentary as the only possible way of fixation, the truth, as it was called. So the Russian title of the whole movement was Kino Pravda, cinema truth, which became very popular in the 50s and the 60s in France. The French term still remains a lone translation of the Russian one. In French it is cinéma vérité. And theoreticians of the French cinéma vérité were basing mainly on the work done in Russia in the 20s. The main Russian theoretician was the person whose pseudonym was Ziga-Vertov. Ziga-Vertov. The real last name was Kaufman, but he's published also always as Ziga-Vertov. He was really a man of genius. Unfortunately, topics of his films are extraordinary, out of modern fashion, so I think much time should pass before he became again widely popular in Russia. The attempts to show his films in our cinematics showed that people are not at all interested, but there are some American scholars who work on history of cinema that like him very much, particularly Anne Michelson, who is one of the editors of very interesting New York avant-garde review, October. The title is taken from Eisenstein's film. And Michelson published a very interesting essay on Ziga-Vertov in one of the last issues of October, possibly a year or two ago. She studied his work, which is called Три песни о Ленине, Three Songs About Lenin. But I think that only in New York you may study this as an artistic creation now. In Moscow that would be completely impossible, you know. Nobody would listen to you, and nobody would see the film. I saw the film last when she came to California, showing the film and discussing. I saw that the audience was quite sympathetic with her description of the film, which really was interesting to me because, as I tell you, that would be impossible now in my country. Ziga-Vertov was really a man of genius, a very interesting person. He didn't work at all in Stalin's time, although he lived at that time, and he was republished and rediscovered immediately after the death of Stalin in his Russian language volume and in his works that are not translated into English. You will find his own discussion of one of his films. Unfortunately, not all of his films are preserved. They were called Kino Pravda, Cinema Truth, number 10, 11, 12. I think that not all numbers are preserved. In one number that I saw, that can be seen in Moscow in cinema archives, there are some fragments that show to us the work in the work of a butcher. So you see how cattle is killed, what they do. He was interested in some technology of the work, as he explained.